My name is Adam Joyce, and I am one of the new two co-presidents of the Calgary chapter. And welcome, everybody. Welcome today. I'm calling in from Amsterdam, and we have people from Calgary. We have people from Montreal. We have people from Toronto. So it's a bit of good afternoon, good evening, and there may be people from Vancouver. So good morning as you finish out the morning. Zafar Jaffer, who you can see, Zafar, if you just want to wave, is our co-president in Calgary and is a partner at Gowlings WLG. Also, we have with us today Bram and Todd and Jane. I'll introduce them in just a moment, but I want to open with just a small housekeeping note. Today's presentation is a bit different. It's a webinar featuring Todd Hirsch from ATB, and I'll introduce you to him. But then we have a second part. And in the second part, we're going to do a little bit of a roundtable and give everyone on the call who wishes to stay on the call a chance to meet each other, talk a little bit about themselves, their company, and any potential deals that they're working on. So we'll organize ourselves in the second part of the hour with that. A brief overview of today. We're launching the M&A Club of Calgary with two new co-presidents, as I said, Zafar and myself. And I would like to introduce you to the founder and the creator of the M&A Club of Canada, Bram Elkin. Bram, if you'd like to take this time to just say a few words, welcome everybody to the Calgary chapter, our first meeting of the 2021 season, and take it away.
Sure. Well, thanks, Adam, and thanks, Zafar, for taking over after Greg. Greg Shannon, who's QC with Gowlings, has now gone on to be a judge. And so we really appreciate Zafar, who's a partner at Gowlings in Calgary, and Adam, who's a successful entrepreneur, I guess, investor and other things, for taking over Calgary. And I'm sure it's going to be a big success. News on the club. It's the usual. The only thing, one of the main things now is that we'll be opening up in New York, most probably in October. We'll have our first lunch. If anybody finds himself in New York, it would be great to have you with us, obviously. We'll let you know the location and date in the next week or two. That's coming up. The webinars continue. This is webinar number 95 or 96. And we're going to hit 100 in October. And the beat goes on until we can have live meetings. So thank you all for being here. And thank you for this creative session today, Adam and Zafar, because it's a combination of webinar and roundtable, which is great. And again, thank you, Todd, for taking your time to inform us today as what's going on in Alberta.
It is now my pleasure to introduce Todd Hirsch, who I've met many times in the Calgary environment and is highly respected here in Calgary, throughout Alberta and across Canada. Todd is the Vice President and Chief Economist for ATB Financial. And for more than 25 years, he has worked as an economist for organizations including Canada West Foundation and the Bank of Canada. He is also the author of 4 books. His latest book is called Spiders in COVID Space, Adapting During and After the Pandemic. It was released in March of 2021. Todd also serves on the board of Calgary Glenbow Museum and the Alberta Ballet. He is also an advisor to the Dean of the Chui School of Business at Bow Valley College in Calgary. Todd, the floor is yours, my friend.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be part of your meeting this afternoon. It's a real honor to be able to give some of my views and some of my thoughts about Alberta and about the Canadian economy in what is certainly an interesting time. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen at this point. Someone want to, Adam, you want to give me a verbal okay? You see the big purple or the big blue screen there?
Yep, you're good to go, Todd.
That's great. From reopen to rebuild, Alberta's economy already now looking into 2022. I want to start first of all with a story that goes back about 500 years. In the 1500s, a Japanese shogun warrior by the name of Ashikaga Yoshimasa, he did something he regretted. He dropped and smashed his favorite porcelain tea bowl. Now, this was not an ordinary tea bowl. This was a very prized tea bowl, very beautiful and very, very costly, that was very dear to Yoshimasa. but he dropped it and broke it. And rather than just replacing it, he wanted to see if he could have it repaired. So he sent the bowl overseas to where it was made. This, of course, took months and months. There was no overnight courier back in those days. But months later, when it arrived in the crate, Yoshimasa opened up the crate, and with great anticipation, he lifted the bowl out. But his heart sank when he beheld the repaired bowl, because the repair job involved ugly metal staples. It had been basically wired together with these ugly metal clips and staples, was not aesthetically pleasing, and it barely held any tea. You can imagine trying to staple back porcelain. So he was very disappointed. Now, here's where we embellish the story a little bit, because we don't know exactly what happened. But it was around this time when Japanese pottery craft people, they might have said, in a way foretelling a television ad 500 years in the future, they said, there must be a better way, how they can repair a porcelain that had been broken rather than bolting it together with wire staples. And that began the art of kintsugi. Kintsugi is the art of embracing damage. What they learned how to do was they took an epoxy glue and infused it with gold fleck and gold leaf. And this gave strength actually to the epoxy. But by doing this, the damage to the tea bowl actually is enhanced. You don't erase the damage. You don't restore the tea bowl back to its original form. However, by embracing the damage and almost highlighting the damage with these gold veins, the bowl actually becomes more aesthetically pleasing. It has a very beautiful organic feel to it. And in fact, it's a stronger bowl than it was before. Now, you might be thinking, why is this economist talking about Japanese pottery? Some of you might be able to foreshadow where I'm going with this metaphor of embracing damage. But kintsugi, and I'll get back to this bowl at the end of the presentation, but kintsugi for now, it is the idea that to repair something requires transformation. And I'm going to use that metaphor to talk about Alberta's economy and indeed the Canadian economy. Before we get there, I do want to take a little bit of a pit stop and talk about the current environment in Alberta. And apologies for those outside of Alberta. I'm not going to be too Alberta-centric, but I do want to talk about the interesting current analysis that's taking place in our province. Our forecasting team at ATB Financial, we are at the moment forecasting growth, real GDP growth this year, of between 6.5% and 7%. I always feel really awkward, pinning it down to like a tenth of a percentage point. I think a range is a little bit more sensible. However, there are some questions about the energy sector, which at the moment is stable. We've seen prices rebound in 2021 after hitting negative oil prices at the early part of the COVID pandemic, around April of 2020. We have seen these oil prices rebound and now hovering around $70 US a barrel. That has given some real stability to the energy sector. Natural gas prices also quite strong. However, the energy sector in Alberta, it is taking on a distinctly new role. And this has been going on, I would say, since 2014. It is no longer the energy, but it is, it is a backbone of Alberta's economy. And of course, you want to protect your backbone, you want to protect your core, but the growth is going to come from other industries, such as the technology and digital sector. We've seen a lot of growth, particularly here in Calgary, but also Edmonton, other places in the province. Over the last 2 or 3 years, a lot of growth, even right through COVID in 2020 in the technology space. Agriculture and agri-foods has also been a growth industry. Now, I do want to note, when we talk about agriculture, traditional crop agriculture, most of Alberta hit this summer with devastating drought. So it's not that 2021 was a banner year. In fact, it was a pretty terrible year for a lot of crop agriculture and a lot of livestock producers. But generally speaking, 2020 was a fantastic year. 2021, not a good year. But overall, when I look into 2022 and beyond, agriculture and agri-foods, so there we're talking food and beverage processing, a real growth industry. Renewable energy, things like wind, solar, hydrogen, geothermal, all of these, there's a lot of activity, a lot of business interest. A lot of them, especially things like geothermal and hydrogen, for Alberta, we are in its infancy. So we're not expecting those to, replace the jobs lost in the hydrocarbon industry anytime soon, but they do add to growth and they do start to move the needle a little bit on diversifying our energy sector. And also clean energy technologies, things like carbon capture, storage, and carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and other forms of clean energy technology, applying really smart ideas to reduce carbon intensity. However, there are some risks to our somewhat rosy forecast of 6.5% to 7%. One is, of course, the severity of this Delta wave that we are dealing with. Now, everyone in Alberta, everyone around the world, I think is pretty disappointed with this fourth wave we're in. Because here in Alberta, when the province reopened everything at the beginning of July, and a lot of people at that point thought maybe this is a little too early, or maybe it's too much reopening all of a sudden. But I think there was this collective sense of, whoof, it's over, and the best summer ever, and all of this talk. And now here we are in September, and cases are back to where they were in May. Hospitalizations are at, near capacity in the ICU. Schools are starting to have outbreaks. So we don't know the severity of this fourth wave we're in. We don't know when it's going to crest. And we also don't know the extent to which it could reduce our economic forecast for this year. But of course, we're going to be watching and revising our forecasts if necessary. Lots of geopolitical events around the world. Things like what's happening in Afghanistan. And it's not so much that Afghanistan is a major oil producer or consumer, it is not, but it is adjacent to that part of the world, the Middle East, which is still a major oil supplier. There are risks that, in fact, the turmoil and crises in Afghanistan could spill out into other parts of the Middle East. That could have impact on oil prices, which of course would hit us here in Alberta. Possibility of a US or a global slowdown. Most global forecasts have already been revised downward from where they were 3 months ago, simply because of this fourth wave, the Delta variant, which is having a slowing effect on global output. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen there. But of course, if we do see the American economy slowing, or the global economy slowing, that of course will weigh on Canada, Alberta, and resource prices. And finally, oil prices themselves, how they might be impacted by a global or US slowdown will definitely affect us here in Alberta. So our outlook at the moment is not too bad, but we are always prepared to make revisions to our forecast. I always like to joke, the secret to good forecasting is revise frequently. That way you're never really wrong. You can always just say, well, the situation has changed, our assumptions have changed, and we're making revisions. So we will be doing that if necessary, but at this point, we're still holding with our forecast of around 6.5% to 7% GDP. But I do want to focus a little bit on one particular aspect of Alberta right now, and in fact, the rest of Canada. And that is this really interesting paradox we're seeing right now in the labor market. We are seeing reports of labor shortages. Lots of businesses, everything from restaurants and the accommodation and food sector, right up to the energy sector, finance, construction sector. A lot of companies, a lot of industries are reporting a shortage of labor. They're having a hard time finding people. However, that is coexisting with a still elevated unemployment rate in Alberta. In other words, there are reports of job shortages or labor shortages, but the unemployment rate is still close to 8% in Alberta. Now, I would note that unemployment rate in Alberta has come down, in fact, encouragingly so, since peaking out at around 15.5%. I think that was in April of 2020. It's now at 7.9%. It's actually come down faster than what I expected. But we have to keep in mind 7.98%, last or in August or July, it was still almost 9%. That's still double the unemployment rate than what Alberta should have, around 4.5%. So we're still dealing with elevated unemployment rates. So how do we explain this paradox? Labor shortages and at the same time, high unemployment. I want to suggest there are 6 factors, I think, and there might be others that you've observed, but I want to share 6 factors that I think are contributing to this fundamental shift we are seeing in the labor market. What are the 6 factors? 1, well, this is a popular theory. It's the lazy worker theory. This is the theory that everyone talks about with the idea, especially young people tend to get kind of painted with this brush. But because there are extended benefits with CERB and extended employment insurance, that people are just unwilling to go back to work. They'd rather just sit on the couch and collect EI. And everybody has a story, right? It's their nephew or their neighbor's kid or somebody, and they make for great stories because it's sort of salacious, this idea that they don't want to go back to work as they're collecting EI. I think this is a factor, but I really do not think it's a very important one when we look at the overall picture. I think it gets repeated a lot because, as I said, the story is sort of fun to tell. And I do think it is happening, but I don't think it's as widespread as people believe. And I don't think it is one of the most significant factors contributing to this situation. There are others that I think are more important, such as the idea that people hated their job and they realized that during COVID. And maybe COVID, once they were sort of pushed off their treadmill and maybe had to sit and think, maybe they were out of work for a while, or they just had more time to sort of re-examine, which I think a lot of people did over COVID. They re-examined a lot of things in life. I do think that a lot of people realized I actually did not like that job. I didn't like that industry. I didn't like the career path I was on, and I'm not going back. Now, it's hard to say how widespread this is, but I do think there's enough information out there and anecdotal stories about people that realized, no, you only get one shot in this life, and I'm not going to continue to do something that was sucking the soul out of my, very being. So they're just not going back. Another factor, I think, during COVID, enough people found new and innovative ways to earn money online. Now, these are unconventional sources of income. But there's all sorts of possible ways to provide your services and your skills to people who need them anywhere in the world. Lots of examples of you can be an executive assistant for somebody who is remote. You can edit photos for somebody who is remote. You can prepare PowerPoint slides and design templates, all sorts of things. And because during COVID, people had more time on their hands, I think a lot of them found, how else can I earn some money? There's a really interesting website called Canva. I think it's based originally in Australia, but basically it connects people all around the world if you've got a service to offer digitally, and will match you with somebody who needs that service. Now, again, I don't think this is that widespread, but I do think it is happening. And I do think it is an example of why some people are reluctant to go back into the traditional job market, especially if it's a job that they didn't like in the first place. Number 4, lack of affordable childcare. This is now getting to be a more significant one. We know that COVID hit women in the workforce far harder than men, predominantly because women are often shouldering the responsibilities more so of children. And when those schools closed down, when the daycares closed down and the kids all went home, a lot of women were, they had to stop working in order to be at home to care for their children. And now, as we're still moving through COVID, even though schools are reopening, a lot of people that have childcare responsibilities are finding it hard to integrate back. This is why during the federal election, every political party is now taking this very seriously, and they all have a plan around dealing with it. Now, they differ in their details around how to deal with it, but it is now more or less unanimous that affordable childcare is one of the most significant ways we can get the labor market back operating. Number 5, early retirement. I think there's also situations, again, people, perhaps 1, 2, 3 years away from planned retirement. COVID hits, everything is thrown into disarray and a lot of uncertainty. I think a lot of people said, well, why even go back? Why don't I just accelerate my retirement plan? And that way I don't even have to worry about, are we going back to the office now, or are we masking, and all of these complications. I think a lot of them just accelerated their retirement plan. Now that might not be a huge portion of the workforce, but I do think it probably represents, some of those higher pay grades, more the director level or manager level, people who are closer to retirement. And then finally, I do think that there is a mismatch between what employers are looking for in skills and what applicants are coming to the interview with. In other words, I think that there is maybe a too wild of an expectation about the skill set that a worker has. A lot of the HR people and a lot of the businesses I've talked to who are experiencing labor shortages, they're telling me, we've got lots of resumes coming in. It's just that none of them have the skills or the experience or the training that we require. So I think there is some work to be done here in getting a better match between the skills that are needed. The problem is, it's in this day and age, it's a moving goalpost. Those skills, and especially in the technical world, technology and digital skills, they change very, very quickly. So the goalpost keeps moving, but it does create some challenge for employers trying to find workers with the right skills. So I offer those as 6 possible factors. I think all of them, to some degree, are causing this situation to happen. As I said, there may be others, but I think these are probably the 6 most important ones. Now, as I conclude, I do want to spend a little bit of time getting back to my original title, and that is moving from reopening the economy to rebuilding the economy. Reopening, in some ways, that's the easy part. And we found out even that actually isn't very easy, but just, allowing a business to reopen after the pandemic, reopening in July. In some ways that's pretty straightforward, but we've got a damaged economy that we have to now rebuild. Now, again, I don't want to make too much of the smashed piece of pottery. I don't want to, exaggerate too much. Overall, Canada's economy, Alberta's economy, we're still relatively good shape. But there are some fractures, there are some cracks that need to be repaired. I want to suggest 3 broad areas of focus that we have to get right as we rebuild our economy into 2022 and beyond. And if we don't get these 3 broad areas right, fiddling with tax policies or, tax credits or specific little programs, the minutia of public policy, none of that is going to be helpful if we do not get these 3 broad areas right. The first, getting back to a little bit what I was just talking about, education, skills, and training, and in some cases, retraining. Now, education, of course, we often look to K-12 and post-secondary, the formal education. And of course, we have to get that right. You almost cannot overemphasize how important it is that we get our K-12 and our post-secondary in good shape. And by and large, I think they are. There's always improvements. But where I'd like to see more effort is early childhood development, and also this idea of lifelong learning. This is where employers and employees have to take some greater responsibility, as workers need to constantly be upgrading their skills. I do think it's a bit of a trap we can fall into, asking governments to provide all of the solutions with retraining programs. I think retraining programs, especially in industries that are, structurally they are shrinking, or finding programs to retrain workers for other industries, those programs are important, but they themselves are not the answer. We need more buy-in from individuals, ourselves, and also the employers. This is where I think more responsibility needs to be taken, each one of us, for our own skill development and training as we move through our career. Number two, social inclusion and addressing economic inequality. Now, this is, you might be, maybe you won't be surprised, but for an economist to talk about all that we've seen in social movements in the last couple of years, the Black Lives Matter, the truth and reconciliation work that we are doing here in Canada. This is a long process. Even, the Me Too movement. We have put up with far too much racism, misogyny, homophobia, xenophobia. Now, we need to address this first and foremost, and I want to be clear, because it's a moral issue. It's the right thing to do. However, if that alone is not enough for you, there is also a really important economic reason we need to get this right. There is so much evidence out there that shows companies with diversity, social diversity in their ranks and in their employment are more creative. This is where innovative ideas come from. If you're sitting around a board table or a director's table, or even a group doing some planning, and you look around that table and everyone looks the same, they talk the same, they dress the same, they went to the same schools, tell the same jokes, they might get along great, but you should not be surprised if you don't see a lot of creative, innovative ideas coming out of that group. Innovative ideas come from diversity. So there is a moral imperative, absolutely, that we need to address these social issues around exclusion, around racism and discrimination. But there is a very, very strong, compelling economic argument why we also need to get this right. Sometimes we talk about, we are allowing people a seat at our table. You especially hear this around Indigenous people, the truth and reconciliation. But the problem I have with this notion of, we're giving them a seat at the table. The problem is it's still our table. What if their chair doesn't fit under our table? And even if you think about this, we're making space for them at our table. Even how colonial that attitude is. Maybe rather than talking about making a space at our table, maybe we need to go and sit at their table for a while. Or even better, maybe we all need to think about how do we redesign new tables for the future that include everybody and address everybody's cultural viewpoints and perspectives. Number three, we need to be more serious about addressing climate change goals and also our commitment as a country to achieving net zero carbon. And I know this can be a bit controversial or irksome for some people, especially in Alberta, where a lot of our traditional hydrocarbon is under some threat of challenge because of this. But rather than viewing it as an obstacle or as a challenge or as a penalty, like a lot of people will tend to, I think we need to embrace this and view this as opportunity. A couple of reasons why. Number one, the rest of the world has moved on. So we can dig our heels in here in Alberta and say, we're not going to do it. It's not fair, but the rest of the world has moved on. Number two, if you ask anybody in capital markets around the world, and I know a lot of you on this call will know a lot more about this than I ever will, but this is where it's not even really from politicians, but action on ESG. This is where the big capital markets, the pools of capital around the world are now insisting on this. Go try to build a pipeline and get, global financing for that. So there is also that market imperative. And number three, the reason why we need to be doing this is simply because it does present lots of new economic opportunities. Yeah, there are going to be some challenges for sure to our traditional hydrocarbon industries. But, I get a bit annoyed when people say, you can't expect us to turn on a dime and, all of this change in industry so sudden. But I would remind them that the first United Nations declaration and signed document recognizing this was 24 years ago. That was a Kyoto Accord, 1997. So to suggest that we are asking anybody to turn on a dime is absolutely ridiculous. We've had time. As a planet, we're running out of time. We need to be serious about this, but we also need to understand there are enormous economic benefits and opportunities This, again, getting back to what I mentioned a bit earlier around renewable energy and clean energy technology. So with that, we finish by once again talking about the Konsugi, the embracing damage. We have a damaged economy. It's not shattered in a million pieces, but there are cracks, there are fractures and fissures, and we need to restore that. But restoring requires transformation, not going back to what we used to be, but in fact embracing damage. It becomes part of the story, and repairing it and turning it into something stronger, more resilient, and for the economy, more prosperous. With that, I will wrap up. I think I've gone a little over time, but I want to thank you for listening, and you can check out my podcast there if you want, or on social media. With that, I will stop sharing and I'll come back and return.
Awesome, Todd. Thank you very much for a wonderful perspective. And I love the provocations that you put forward as well, to cause us all to think a little bit and to watch what the future holds and participate, the invitation to participate in that future. Thank you. We do have a couple of questions. One is asking about the comparison of Alberta's GDP in 2021 to pre-COVID. Did we see a rate change or an escalation change or any deltas there? Was pre-COVID a better forecast than what we're living now?
Well, as an aside, I love the word. I love that you use the word delta, as economists and engineers like to use the change in something. Delta now takes on a whole different meaning, but it's all about the delta. The absolute level of GDP in Alberta has not returned to pre-COVID levels, and it probably won't, I would say, even until 2022 at some point. We sustained an 8.2% real drop in activity in 2020. It was the largest of any Canadian province, a lot of it having to do with challenges in the oil and gas. But an 8.2% drop is not easily recovered. Even if we see 6.5% and 7%, and even that is a bit at risk, it doesn't get us back to the level. And even more, I guess, startling is when you look at Alberta's economy prior to the 2015 oil price collapse, we're not even back to where we were in 2014. We sustained 2 massive years of recession in 15 and 2016. 2017 and 18 were modest rebounds, but 2019 was actually another small dip for Alberta. And then 2020, it all kind of went crazy. So we got a long way to go, not only to achieve pre-COVID levels, but also 2014 levels. And I would, that is something to keep in mind, but rather than looking at the absolute size of the economy, I'm more interested in the quality and the direction of what we're doing with our economy, not just the size of what we're producing.
Yeah. Thank you. Do you have any opinion on foreign investment as an accelerant to our economy here in Alberta?
Yeah, I do. And Alberta, we've always relied on foreign investment, probably more so, I would believe, than in any other province. Most of it in our traditional hydrocarbons. And going forward, foreign investment, I think, is going to remain important. But here is where it shifts gears a little bit. It's not going to be as much around traditional hydrocarbons. I believe, and others on this call again might know far more about this, but there's a lot of capital in the world right now, but they are looking for strong opportunities around ESG, around environmental sustainability, around achieving carbon reduction goals. I think that is where there's a lot of opportunity for Alberta. We could be a world leader in that. We're already the best geologists in the world. So for example, how do we spin that into opportunities in geothermal? So it's my belief, and again, you guys are the experts, but it's my belief that there is a lot of foreign capital for Alberta, but it has to be directed in the right areas.
Excellent, Todd. Excellent. Well, we have taken your time. It's been a fantastic conversation. There's other cheekier questions that have arisen, but unfortunately we're out of time. And as Todd has invited, you can listen to his podcast or reach out and participate in conversation with him on Alberta's economy. So Todd, thank you so much on behalf of the M&A Club Calgary and my other panelists here. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much. And I wish you all a great afternoon and a great rest of 2021.